The chamber was cold, stone bare, and suffocating with the threat of death. Before the throne stood a priest, unarmed, unadorned, and entirely alone. King Wenceslas IV leaned forward from his seat, his voice low with an authority that had crushed nobles, silenced bishops, and terrified the entire nation into submission. He laid out the terms with absolute clarity. On one side, unimaginable reward, chests of gold, supreme political favor, and the prestigious bishopric of Olomouc. On the other, the rack, the red-hot irons, and a dark, icy drop into the rushing currents of the Vltava River. The requirement for his life and freedom was simple, a single sentence, a whisper of what the Queen had confessed behind the closed doors of the confessional. The monarch held absolute power over life and death. He possessed the full might of an empire to enforce his will. The king waited for his answer. What happened next was a moment so completely unexpected, a response so startling that no one in that room could have anticipated it, that its echo would ring across the centuries. Prague, 1393. No one said no to Wenceslas IV. This was not the pious 10th century saint remembered in legend as Good King Wenceslas, but a far darker namesake, a 14th century monarch ruled by an explosive temper and an obsessive demand for total control. He had deposed nobles, imprisoned bishops, and terrified his court into absolute submission. When his rage flared, men agreed to sign away their land, their titles, and their very names just to walk out of the room alive. His authority over the realm was complete, unquestioned, and terrifying. Among the clergy in the city was John, a priest, a doctor of canon law, and the vicar general of the Archdiocese of Prague. He was a man of learning and quiet competence, managing the administrative affairs of the church and fulfilling his daily spiritual duties. One of those duties brought him into the inner circle of the palace. He served as confessor to Queen Sophia. The queen sought regular spiritual counsel, kneeling before the priest in the privacy of the confessional. But outside those doors, King Wenceslas was unraveling under a dark, consuming paranoia. Suspecting traitors in every corner and suspicious of his wife's private life, the monarch demanded complete access to her private thoughts. He didn't just want political dominance, he wanted the secrets of the queen's soul. And to get them, he summoned the priest who had heard her sins. When John was brought into the king's private chambers, the heavy doors were shut, guarded by armed men and locked behind him. There was no trial, no counsel, and no legal proceeding. Wenceslas made his demand brief. He wanted to know what the queen had confessed. To the king it was a simple favor, a few whispered words in exchange for the wealthy bishopric of Olomouc, chests of gold, and royal favor. Refusal meant the rack, the torch, and the cold depths of the Vltava River. John stood before the throne. He was a diplomat and a doctor of canon law. He knew how power worked, and he knew what the king's torturers could do to a human body. So when Wenceslas demanded his answer, John actually agreed to respond. As the king waited, John stood up and walked toward him. Then he walked past the king, knelt beside the monarch's hunting hound, resting in the corner, and whispered the secret into the animal's ear. The room went dead silent. In an instant, the tyrant's terrifying authority was turned into a farce. John had technically obeyed the command to speak, yet preserved his sacred vow, mocking the king's rage without uttering a single treasonous word. White with rage, Wenceslas demanded how he dared defy the crown and refused to reveal what was told to him in the confessional. John looked him in the eye. "I will rather die 1,000 times." Driven to a fury by the humiliation, Wenceslas had him dragged down into the stone vaults beneath the palace. The king's torturer stretched his body on the rack until his joints groaned, and scorched his sides with hot irons, filling the pitch-black dungeon with the smell of burning flesh. Wenceslas stood over him, watching the physical collapse of a man stripped of every earthly defense. Then the king paused the iron. He gave John one last chance. It didn't require a public retraction or a grand surrender. Just a few whispered words, a single sentence spoken into the king's ear. In an instant, the pain would stop. The torturers would lower their irons. He would be carried out of the dark, restored to his office, and given the wealth and favor of the crown. The door to freedom was wide open. John looked at the monarch through the smoke and agony and simply closed his eyes. In that dark vault, Wenceslas finally faced a terrifying truth. He was completely powerless. He held armies, dungeons, and executioners, but sitting on the stool of judgment, he realized he had zero leverage. He could break John's bones, but he could not force his tongue. Wenceslas ruled an earthly kingdom, but John answered to an eternal one, living out the gospel command, "Do not fear the one who can harm the body, but cannot touch the soul." All of it could have ended in a single sentence. He could have chosen relief, honor, and life. But to John, it was never about an empire, a bishopric, or a political rivalry. He was keeping a promise, not to the queen and not to the court, but to the sacrament itself. He knew that if a priest breaks the seal of confession for a king, he breaks it for everyone. He breaks it for the nervous farmer whispering his debts in the dark. He breaks it for the terrified orphan confessing a stolen loaf of bread. To yield to the tyrant's fire meant telling the smallest, poorest soul in Prague that their secret was not safe with God. Realizing that no amount of pain would break the priest's silence, Wenceslas ordered his final solution. Shortly before his arrest, St. John had a divine premonition of his fate. In his final sermon to the people of Prague, he opened with the words Jesus spoke to his apostles on the night before his crucifixion. "A little while and you shall not see me, and again a little while you shall see me." Just as Christ was preparing his followers for death and resurrection, John was warning his own flock of his impending martyrdom, promising that though he would soon be taken from them, his witness would ultimately endure. On the night of March 20th, 1393, the king's men bound John's hands, gagged his mouth, and carried his broken body through the deserted streets to the high arch of the Charles Bridge. The strategy was simple and absolute. Hurl him into the rushing black waters of the Vltava River. The deep currents would swallow his body, destroy his reputation, erase his story, and bury the memory of his defiance forever in total obscurity. It was the same worldly logic that drove the enemies of Christ. When they nailed Jesus to the cross, they believed the crucifixion would silence his voice, dismantle his movement, and end his story in shame. But God's ways are not man's ways. Just as the darkness of Calvary brought about the light of salvation, the tyrant's attempt to erase John only magnified his glory. The moment John's body struck the freezing water, the dark river did not hide him. Instead, 5 radiant stars miraculously appeared on the surface of the Vltava, floating over the rushing currents like a heavenly crown, marking the exact spot of his martyrdom and illuminating the night sky over Prague. The very act meant to plunge him into forgotten dark became the eternal beacon of his holiness. King Wenceslas IV believed that by drowning the priest in the dark, he would secure his own absolute rule and silence his critics forever. Instead, the execution sealed the king's ruin. The murder of the vicar general sent shockwaves across Europe, alienated his nobles, and ignited an open rebellion that saw Wenceslas captured and imprisoned by his own lords. He had stood on the threshold of ultimate power, on track to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor, but his tyranny destroyed his legacy. Within 7 years, his electors stripped him of his crown as King of the Romans and ruler of Germany, leaving him deposed, disgraced, and remembered by history as a broken tyrant. John, however, belonged to history. He was a doctor of canon law, vicar general of Prague, a man of profound learning and persuasive speech. Yet his greatest sermon was preached in silence. When everything was threatened, his comfort, his reputation, and his very life, he simply remained silent like a lamb led to the slaughter. In 1729, John of Nepomuk was canonized and proclaimed the martyr of silence. In the end, he had simply followed the command of his master, "Take up your cross and follow me." John was offered gold, honor, and safety if he would betray what had been entrusted to him. He chose none of them. As a priest, Christ had placed souls in his care, and John understood that sacred trust was worth more than his comfort, his freedom, or even his life. The king could offer him the treasure of the world. He could threaten torture. He could finally take John's life. But there was one thing he could never take from him: his silence.